There is a peculiar quiet that settles over a battlefield once the fighting stops. Imagine it with me now, the late afternoon light slanting gold and red across torn earth, the acrid smell of gunpowder still hanging in the cooling air, and beneath it all, a silence so complete it feels almost sacred. This is the moment that rarely appears in histories. The textbooks speak of victories and defeats, of generals and strategies, but they do not often linger here, in this strange, suspended time when the survivors begin to understand what has just occurred. In the American Civil War, soldiers on both sides describe this moment with something close to reverence. After hours of deafening musket fire and artillery thunder, the sudden absence of sound became almost overwhelming. One Union private wrote in his diary that the silence pressed against my ears like hands, that he could hear his own heartbeat so loudly it frightened him. But the silence was never truly complete. If you listened carefully, and many did, standing frozen in the aftermath, you would hear other sounds emerging. The low moaning of wounded men scattered across the field. The nervous whinnying of horses, confused and frightened. Sometimes, someone crying, not dramatically, but with the quiet, helpless sound of exhaustion and shock. In this in-between time, something strange would often happen. The clear boundaries of enemy and ally would blur, just for a little while. Confederate and Union soldiers alike would move carefully through the field, looking for their own wounded, and sometimes, without speaking of it afterward, they would help carry an enemy soldier to safety as well. There are letters that mention this, brief, almost embarrassed mentions, as if the writers knew they were confessing something that shouldn't be spoken aloud. One Georgia farmer, conscripted into service, wrote to his wife about helping a northern boy, probably no more than 16, who was crying for his mother. I gave him water, he wrote simply, and I did not think of which flag he wore. These were the moments commanders did not record in their official reports. These were the incidents that made the narrative of war, the clean story of us versus them, begin to fray at the edges. The silence after battle held something else too, a kind of processing, a collective pause where thousands of men had to reckon with what they had just done. They had shot at other human beings. They had watched friends die. They had survived, and they were not sure if that was fortune or curse. Nightfall would come eventually, and with it, the difficult work of the burial details would begin. But in those first hours after the guns went quiet, there was only this strange, heavy silence, broken by small sounds, small acts of mercy, and the slow, reluctant return to the world of the living. And if you were there, standing in that field as the shadows lengthened, you might have noticed the birds beginning to return, cautiously, landing on split fence rails, their small songs tentative at first, then gradually growing bolder, reclaiming the air from the smoke and the sorrow. And the sun continued its gentle descent, indifferent and eternal, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. Some soldiers in the trenches of World War I spoke of this only to chaplains or doctors, confessing it as if it were a sin. They would describe the taste, metallic and wrong, and how they would force themselves not to think about what they were consuming, how their minds would go deliberately blank, focusing only on the sensation of wetness against their parched throats. Medical officers knew this happened far more often than was ever officially acknowledged. They would see the illnesses that followed, the dysentery and fever, and they would understand the source without needing to ask. In their private correspondence, some doctors expressed frustration at the Army's reluctance to prioritize clean water supplies, but such complaints were rarely heeded. The thirst did something to men's minds as well. After several days without adequate water, hallucinations would begin. Soldiers would see lakes that weren't there, rivers shimmering in the distance that would vanish as they approached. Some men would become convinced that their officers were hoarding water, leading to conflicts that threatened unit cohesion. There were moments of unexpected kindness too, of course. Soldiers who had water would sometimes share with enemies, passing canteens across no man's land during unofficial truces. These acts of basic humanity, These acknowledgments that thirst transcends nationality were often omitted from official accounts, as they complicated the narrative of total war. But the men remembered. Years later, in letters and late-night conversations, they would speak of the thirst more vividly than they spoke of the battles themselves. They would remember the exact taste of the first clean water after days without. They would remember the relief, so profound it brought tears, of finally drinking their fill. And somewhere, a canteen lid clinked softly shut, and a soldier closed his eyes in grateful silence. Now, let us walk carefully through the subject of burial, those hurried, makeshift ceremonies that mark the end of so many stories. Settle yourself a bit deeper into your pillow, let your shoulders relax, and imagine, if you can, the work that came after every battle, the work that was necessary but never celebrated, never memorialized in monuments or songs. The burial details. These were often the youngest soldiers, the newest recruits, assigned to this duty as a kind of initiation, a brutal welcoming to the realities of war. They would move across the battlefield with shovels and wagons, their faces wrapped in cloths soaked with vinegar or camphor, anything to mask the smell. In the heat of summer, this work had to be done quickly. Bodies could not wait. So the burial parties would work through the night sometimes, by lantern light, digging long trenches rather than individual graves, because there were simply too many, and too little time. What they saw, what they handled, aged these young men in ways that had nothing to do with time. There are letters that survived, letters written years later, when the writers were old and felt, perhaps, that they could finally speak of these things. They describe how different the dead looked from living soldiers. How small they seemed. How young. How their faces, in death, lost all the distinctions of rank or nation, until it was difficult to remember which army they had belonged to. The burial parties were instructed to search the bodies first, to collect identification and personal effects to be sent home to families. This was policy. But the reality was more complicated. Sometimes, and this was spoken of only in whispers, soldiers would keep small items. Not valuables exactly, but letters from home. Photographs. A lock of hair tied with ribbon. They kept these things not from greed, but from a kind of sorrowful kinship, a desire to honor these dead strangers, to carry some small piece of them forward into the living world. One British soldier in the trenches of World War I kept a journal where he recorded the names he found on letters and identity tags, hundreds of names, both British and German, as if by writing them down he could somehow prevent them from being completely forgotten. He carried this journal for the rest of his life, never showing it to anyone, but never destroying it either. The burial details learned to work in silence mostly. Conversation felt wrong somehow. Disrespectful. So they moved through their grim work with only the sounds of shovels and earth, the soft thud of wrapped bodies being lowered into trenches, the occasional murmured prayer. Sometimes they buried men they had known, had shared meals with, had laughed with just days before. The procedures didn't change. The work went on. But those burials were harder, marked by longer pauses, by hands that trembled slightly as they lowered friends into the ground. And then there were the things they found that they couldn't bury, or couldn't make sense of. A child's toy soldier in a grown man's pocket. A wedding ring on a chain around a neck. A half-written letter that ended mid-sentence. These objects told stories, fragmentary and incomplete, of lives interrupted, of futures that would never arrive. The burial parties carried these fragments back to camp, tried to catalog them, tried to return them to families when possible. But many items were never claimed. They remained in warehouses and offices, uncanny artifacts, bearing witness to losses that could never be fully calculated. And the earth settled over silence, and grass would, in time, grow green again. Let us turn now to those who stood at the edges of war, the ones whose eyes saw everything but whose voices were rarely recorded. The children. Breathe slowly now, and imagine a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing at a farmhouse window as soldiers march past. She has been told to stay inside, to be quiet, to not draw attention. But she watches anyway, her face pressed against the cool glass, trying to understand what is happening to her world. In nearly every war, children have been spectators, witnesses to violence they had no framework to comprehend. And the adults around them, well-meaning, would often try to shield them through silence. "Don't speak of it," parents would say. "Try to forget what you've seen." But children do not forget. There are memoirs, written late in life, by people who were children during the American Civil War, or the Franco-Prussian War, or the wars that tore through China and India and South America. They describe memories that remained vivid for 70, 80 years, the specific blue of a soldier's coat, the sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground, the morning they woke to find their barn had been commandeered and their horses taken. What troubled these children most, many of them wrote, was not the dramatic violence, though that was frightening enough, but rather the subtle transformations they witnessed in the adults around them. The way their mother's hands would shake when she heard hoofbeats on the road. The way their father's face would go blank and distant. The way neighbors stopped speaking to each other over loyalties and suspicions. Children learned to read the signs of approaching danger. They learned which sounds meant soldiers were coming, learned to hide food, learned to make themselves very small and very quiet. Some learned these skills so thoroughly they carried them into adulthood, flinching at sudden noises decades later, unable to fully relax even in peacetime. In occupied territories, children often became invisible messengers, carrying notes between resistance members, because soldiers paid less attention to children. These young couriers understood, in their way, that they were part of something important, something dangerous. But they also understood that they could not speak of it, not to friends, not to teachers, not even to siblings who might accidentally reveal the secret. The burden of these silences shaped lives in ways that are only now being understood. There were orphans too, of course, more than could be counted. Children who lost parents to battle or disease or starvation. They were absorbed into distant relatives' homes if they were fortunate, or into institutions if they were not. Either way, they learned to carry their grief quietly, to not burden others with their losses. Some of these children formed their own communities, small bands in devastated cities, living in bombed-out buildings, sharing scraps of food, creating their own rules and hierarchies. They became adept at survival, at finding overlooked resources, at staying hidden from authorities who might separate them or send them away. And later, decades later, when historians would interview these survivors, now elderly, many would say that what they remembered most was not the fear or the hunger, but rather the strange liberation of it. The way the normal rules had ceased to apply. The way they had been forced to become more resourceful, more independent than children should ever need to be. But their eyes, even in old age, often retained a kind of wariness, a readiness, as if some part of them was still that child at the window, watching and waiting. And in the growing dusk, a child's footsteps whispered across floorboards, soft as memory. Finally, as you rest here in the darkness, let us consider the soldiers who came home, and yet somehow didn't. The ones who physically survived, who walked off ships or trains back into their old lives, but who carried within them something that had fundamentally changed, something that made home feel foreign. This was perhaps the most unmentionable aspect of war, the way it created ghosts who still breathed. In the years after the American Civil War, there were men who simply couldn't settle back into civilian life. They would sit at dinner tables with families who loved them, and feel as if they were watching the scene from a great distance. The conversation about crops or neighbors or church socials seemed to be in a language they no longer fully understood. Some would leave again, restless, unable to explain even to themselves what was wrong. They became drifters, moving from town to town, taking temporary work, never quite connecting with the places they passed through. Their families would mourn them as if they had died, because in a sense, The man who had left for war had not returned, only his shell had come home. Doctors of the era had no vocabulary for what we might now call post-traumatic stress. They spoke vaguely of soldier's heart or nervous exhaustion, diagnoses that captured nothing of the actual experience. Many veterans were simply told to have more discipline, to exercise more willpower, as if trauma were a weakness that could be overcome through force of will. The most painful part, the part that rarely made it into any record, was the isolation these men felt. They could not speak of what they had experienced, could not find words that would make sense to people who hadn't been there. And they discovered quickly that civilians didn't really want to hear anyway. They wanted the returning soldiers to confirm comfortable narratives about honor and necessary sacrifice, not to speak of the complicated, disturbing realities. So the veterans learned to stay quiet, to nod along when people spoke of the war in simple terms, to keep their night terrors private, to drink alone if they needed to drink. Some found each other, gathering in groups, where they could speak more honestly. These informal gatherings, in saloons or public squares, became a kind of mutual support, though no one called it that. They would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing fragments of stories. And there was relief in being with others who understood without needing detailed explanations. But many veterans never found even this limited comfort. They lived out their lives carrying their unspoken experiences, growing old with memories that never faded, never softened the way ordinary memories do. On quiet nights, they might find themselves back in those moments, the smell of powder smoke suddenly vivid in their nostrils, the sound of a door slamming transformed into rifle fire. Their families learned to read the signs, learned when to approach and when to leave space, learned which topics to avoid. It became a kind of silent choreography, everyone moving carefully around the veteran's invisible wounds, pretending that everything was normal, that the man at the table was the same man who had left. And perhaps, in the darkness before sleep, these veterans would sometimes wonder who they might have been, if the war had never happened, if that other life, that unlived life, might have been easier to inhabit. And the night deepened, and breaths slowed, and finally, gently, there was rest. And so, we've walked together through these quiet shadows, these fragments of history that prefer the darkness. Let them settle now into the back of your mind, let your breathing grow even slower, deeper, and know that the past, with all its sorrows and silences, has passed. You are here, now, safe, and the night will hold you gently until morning. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let history, for now, drift away.